The chapel was packed that sweltering August afternoon, every pew filled with guests fanning themselves with ceremony programs. Sarah Mitchell stood at the end of the aisle in her ivory gown, her heart hammering against her ribs as the opening notes of the wedding march began to play. She had dreamed of this moment for 27 years, and now it was finally happening. The dress had been custom-made, each seam carefully constructed to flatter her full figure. Sarah had always been a larger woman, and after years of crash diets, weight loss programs, and the endless cycle of losing and gaining back the same 40 pounds, she had finally made peace with her body. She was beautiful, she told herself. Michael loved her exactly as she was. That was all that mattered. Her father squeezed her arm gently as they began the slow walk down the aisle. Sarah could see Michael waiting at the altar, his eyes already glistening with tears. Her best friend Jenny stood beside the altar as maid of honor, beaming with pride. Everything was perfect. Then came the moment that would change everything. The chapel had been decorated with rustic elegance, incorporating Sarah's love for country charm. 2 vintage wagons flanked the altar, overflowing with wildflowers and trailing ivy. It had been Jenny's idea to have Sarah and Michael exchange their vows while standing in one of the wagons, elevated slightly above their guests in a symbolic gesture of embarking on their journey together. After her father gave her away and took his seat, Sarah gathered her skirts and prepared to step up into the wagon. Michael was already inside, extending his hand to help her up. She placed her satin pump on the wagon's edge and reached for his hand. That's when she heard it, a sickening crack of old wood giving way. The wagon's side panel, weakened by age and the weight of the elaborate floral arrangements, splintered and collapsed. Sarah tumbled backward, her dress billowing around her as she fell onto the platform with a heavy thud. Gasps rippled through the congregation, followed by something worse. Laughter. Not kind, sympathetic laughter, but the cruel, mocking kind that cut straight through to the soul. "Guess she finally fell off the wagon for good," someone whispered loudly enough for half the chapel to hear. More snickers followed. Sarah lay there in a tangle of ivory silk and tulle, her veil askew, her face burning with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floorboards and never be seen again. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and instead, she was a spectacle, a joke, the punchline to a cruel observation about her weight. Michael scrambled out of the wagon, his face red with anger at the laughter, but Sarah could barely look at him. She tried to push herself up, but the dress was caught beneath her, and her ankle throbbed where she had twisted it in the fall. Tears streamed down her face, ruining the makeup that had taken 2 hours to apply. The laughter continued, and Sarah heard more whispered comments floating through the air. "Poor thing. I knew that wagon couldn't hold. Should have had a backup plan." Each word was another knife to her already shattered dignity. Then, through her tears, she saw a figure moving through the crowd with purposeful strides. Jack Thornton, the owner of the ranch where they were holding the reception, had been sitting near the back. She barely knew him. He was a friend of Michael's family who had generously offered his property for their celebration. He was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of solid presence that came from decades of hard work. He didn't ask permission or wait for an invitation. He simply walked right up to where Sarah lay crying, knelt down beside her, and without a word, slid one arm under her knees and the other around her shoulders. In one smooth, powerful motion, he lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. The laughter died immediately. Jack stood there holding Sarah, his expression stern as he swept his gaze across the congregation. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried through the suddenly silent chapel with unmistakable authority. "I'm going to tell you folks a story," he began, still holding Sarah securely in his arms. "About 30 years ago, I lost my wife, Catherine, in a car accident. She was the love of my life, the strongest person I ever knew. And she was a big woman, probably weighed more than this beautiful bride right here." He paused, and Sarah could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her side. She had stopped crying, transfixed by his words, as was everyone else in the chapel. "Catherine could outwork any ranch hand I ever hired. She could deliver a breech calf at midnight, cook breakfast for 20 people at dawn, and still have energy to dance with me under the stars at night. She had a laugh that could light up a whole county, and she loved with every ounce of her being. When she died, I thought my world had ended." Jack's voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the emotion underneath. For years after, I blamed myself. Wondered if I'd told her enough how beautiful she was, how much I loved her. Wondered if the cruelty of the world had worn her down, made her feel less than she was. Because I'll tell you what, the world was cruel. People made comments. They laughed. They made assumptions about who she was based on nothing but her size. He adjusted his hold on Sarah slightly, making sure she was comfortable. But here's what I learned. The people who laugh, they're the ones who are broken inside. They're the ones who are so small in spirit that they can only feel big by making others feel small. They don't know the first thing about strength, or courage, or real beauty. Jack turned to look directly at Sarah, his eyes kind. Young lady, you had the courage to stand up here in front of all these people and declare your love. You had the courage to be vulnerable, to be yourself, to refuse to hide. That takes a strength most people will never understand. And anyone who would mock that, anyone who would laugh at another person's pain, doesn't deserve to witness the kind of love you and your groom are promising each other today. He then turned back to the congregation, his voice becoming firmer. My Catherine taught me that a person's worth has nothing to do with the number on a scale or the size of their clothes. It has everything to do with the size of their heart, the depth of their character, and the courage they show in living their truth. This bride here has more grace in her little finger than some of you will ever have in your whole lives. The chapel was completely silent now. Several people looked ashamed, staring down at their hands. Others nodded slowly, seeming to really hear what Jack was saying. Now, Jack continued, we're going to start this ceremony again. I'm going to set this beautiful bride down, and she and her groom are going to exchange their vows right here on solid ground. Because their love doesn't need elevation or decoration. It doesn't need to be performed on a wagon or a stage. It just needs to be witnessed and honored by people who understand what really matters. He looked at the pastor, who nodded eagerly. Then Jack gently set Sarah on her feet, making sure her twisted ankle could bear her weight. She tested it carefully and found it was only slightly sore. Thank you, Sarah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Jack smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile. You remind me of her, you know. Same spirit. Same refusal to be anything but yourself. That's the rarest kind of beautiful there is. He stepped back and nodded to Michael, who had been watching the entire scene with tears streaming down his face. Michael moved forward and took Sarah's hands in his. I love you, Michael said fiercely. I love every single thing about you. And if anyone here has a problem with that, they can leave right now. Nobody moved. In fact, several people who had been laughing earlier were now crying, whether from shame or from being moved by Jack's words, Sarah couldn't tell. But the atmosphere in the chapel had completely transformed. The pastor cleared his throat and began the ceremony again. This time, standing on the solid floor, with Michael's hands gripping hers tightly, Sarah spoke her vows with a clear, strong voice. The words had even more meaning now after what had happened, after Jack's unexpected defense, after being reminded that her worth was not determined by others' cruelty. When they were pronounced husband and wife and Michael kissed her, the chapel erupted in genuine warm applause. No more mocking whispers, no more cruel laughter. Just celebration. At the reception later, held in Jack's beautiful ranch, Sarah sought him out. She found him near the barn, checking on the horses. I don't know how to thank you, she said. What you did, what you said, I'll never forget it. Jack turned and gave her that same kind smile. You don't need to thank me. I just said what needed saying. But I'll tell you something my Catherine used to say. She said that our bodies are just the houses we live in, and some houses are bigger than others, but it's the light inside that matters. Your light is bright, Sarah. Don't ever let anyone dim it. Sarah hugged him then, this near stranger who had become her unlikely hero. I wish I could have met Catherine. She would have loved you, Jack said simply. She would have recognized a kindred spirit. As Sarah walked back to the reception, back to her new husband and their celebration, she felt different. The humiliation of the fall, the cruelty of the laughter, it had all been transformed into something else by Jack's intervention. She had been reminded that true strength isn't about being perfect or meeting others' expectations. It's about being authentic, about loving and being loved, about standing back up when you fall. The wedding guests who had laughed seemed different now too. Several approached her throughout the evening to apologize, some with tears in their eyes. Jack's words had clearly affected more than just Sarah. They had held up a mirror to everyone present, forcing them to examine their own prejudices and cruelties. Years later, Sarah and Michael would name their first daughter Catherine, after the woman they never met but who had taught them through Jack's love and remembrance what truly mattered in life. And whenever Sarah felt judged or diminished, she would remember that August afternoon when a rancher lifted her up, not just physically, but in every way that mattered, and reminded her and everyone present about the true meaning of strength, beauty, and grace.